Well, it's a delight to welcome you to our Distinguished Visitors Dialogue. My name's David King, and as the Karen Lake Buttrey Director of Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, it's a pleasure to have you join us as a part of this conversation. Our mission at Lake Institute is to foster a greater understanding of the dynamic relationship between faith and giving through research, through education, and public conversation and understanding. Our Distinguished Visitors series is one chief way that we've developed these conversations. For over 15 years now, we've brought leading practitioners at the intersections of faith and philanthropy to the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy to share with our constituencies here in our home of Indianapolis. But with so much change and loss over this last year, one silver lining is our ability to open up these conversations online to our friends and partners around the country and around the world. And so we're so glad that you've joined us today and look forward to connecting with you. We'll have a time for a Q&A with our distinguished guest just a bit later in our conversation. And I'd invite you, I know we're all familiar with Zoom at this point, to feel free to drop any of those questions you might have through the Q&A box through the Zoom platform at the bottom of your screen. And we'll hope to be able to ask as many of those questions as we can later in our conversation. And so without further ado, let me introduce our guest today. First, the Right Reverend Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows serves as the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Indianapolis. She holds a bachelor's degree in architecture, where she received a minor in urban studies from Smith College. In addition, she has an MA in historic preservation, planning from Cornell, and an MDiv from Church Divinity School of the Pacific. And before being elected as bishop here in 2016, she served the Diocese of Newark, Central New York, and Chicago. And she's the first Black woman to be elected as a diocesan bishop in the Episcopal Church USA. Alongside Bishop Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows is David Dodson, who is past president and now senior fellow of MDC, a nonprofit organization that works with leaders at all levels to expand opportunity and equity throughout the American South. As MDC's president from 1999 until just recently with his retirement in 2020, he led place-based work across the South to address stalled economic mobility. And he also founded MDC's Passing Gear Philanthropy Institute, where he currently works with Southern philanthropic leaders and partners to expand catalytic philanthropy in the region. Prior to joining MDC, David served as executive director of the Cummins Engine Foundation, just down the road from us in Columbus, Indiana. He's a Eucharistic minister at his local Episcopal church, and as a graduate of Yale University, received a BA in architecture and urban policy, and an MDiv degree in as well as public-private management. Moderating our discussion today is Dr. Elizabeth Lynn, who serves as project director of Shifting Ground, a major initiative of Lake Institute focused on expanding and deepening conversations about faith, philanthropy, and the future of American communities. Supported by a generous grant from our friends at the Lilly Endowment. Dr. Lynn brings great depth of experience and expertise in fostering reflection on philanthropy and community engagement, just the kind of conversation we're hoping to foster today. As the founder of the Center for Civic Reflection, she's authored and contributed to a variety of texts and anthologies for reflective conversation. You might look towards the civicreflection.org, an online library used by a number of educators and leaders fostering these types of conversations. She received her PhD in religion and literature from the University of Chicago and has served as a leading voice in public humanities, local government, and philanthropy. So we are delighted at Lake Institute and the School of Philanthropy to welcome you to this conversation and look forward to engaging with you in this dialogue. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Elizabeth, who will facilitate our conversation today.
Thank you so much, David. And thanks to all who have joined us. We have a robust audience out there, and I know we're going to have a robust conversation here, especially with your good questions as they pop into the Q&A. This is just such an honor to bring together these two exemplary leaders at the intersection of faith and philanthropy. Bishop Jennifer and David, you have helped us in your own places and ways enact our philanthropy faithfully and enact our faith philanthropically. And so we're going to want to really dig into what that means and what that means for our common life. But in preparing for this conversation, we discovered a random biographical fact that really surprised us. Both of you studied architecture as undergraduates. So I'd really like to start there and start with you, Bishop Jennifer. What led you to architecture and what led you in other directions?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so delighted to be with you. Wherever you are experiencing this webinar, I'm just delighted to be in your presence and grateful for some time to talk about some interesting things that are so of the moment. So I chose architecture early in my freshman year of college because after fretting about what to major in, you know, that pressure that everyone has, at least back in the day, you could actually go to college not knowing exactly what you wanted to do. And so I had played with politics, I'd played with psychology, but I didn't really love it in terms of study. And so finally, my mom said, just study what you love. And I remembered that what I loved growing up in New York City was just walking around and looking at the gorgeous architecture. I grew up in Brooklyn for the first 10 years of my life in a housing project, and we would go every Saturday to downtown Brooklyn to go shopping, and we would pass in the Ballroom Hill neighborhood, brownstone after brownstone, just gorgeous, you know, early 20th and late 19th century buildings. And as I grew up and went to high school in Midtown Manhattan, I was just surrounded by amazing skyscrapers of all kinds. And I would spend hours after school just walking and looking at the buildings. And so when it became time to declare a major, I took a class on the history of architecture and landscape design and just could not get enough of it and declared immediately. And it has been one of the great blessings of my life to have that passion available to me to delve into. It was not until I was out of college that I was baptized and joined the Episcopal Church, and joined the Episcopal Church I did because I loved the building from the outside. I'd never been in, had studied it, had never been inside Trinity Church, Wall Street. And so that put me on a journey that then, oddly enough, led me to being asked to discern ordination in the Episcopal Church. But I didn't want to give up architecture. So my vocation, dual vocation, really has been about church buildings and faith life for the last 35 years or so now.
Thank you so much. And you had a wonderful interview in Faith and Leadership, the Duke Divinity newsletter recently, focusing exactly on the question of building. So we'll make sure that we send out that link in our chat box. But great conversation. David Dodson, how about you? What took you to architecture and then in another way?
Wow. Well, there's some parallels with the bishop's story. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and as a child, Washington's the greatest free city in the world, meaning there's so many free attractions. And particularly in summer, it would be a ritual that we would go downtown to the mall and visit the Smithsonian and visit the monuments and visit what were then called the Watergate concerts, where the symphony and Marine and Army band played on steps that led from the back of the Lincoln Memorial down to the Potomac River. So I was sort of nurtured in the spacious beauty of our capital with the mall and these monuments, and it was sort of a natural home. But more significantly, from kindergarten through high school, my education took place on the grounds of the National Cathedral. I went to the elementary and to the boys' school there, and also sang in the choir of men and boys as a boy. And during the whole time I was there, the cathedral was in the process of being built. So you can imagine watching a hand-built Gothic cathedral emerge outside your classroom had to have had some sort of impact on both my love of architecture and I know for certain singing as we did rigorously 15 hours a week in the boy choir, services every day, twice on Sunday, music and that incredible Gothic majesty were the channels and the channels for my faith formation, for certain. So, you know, having a Gothic cathedral appear before your eyes is a whole lot more fun than Tinker Toys and Lego. It's just real. So I have a feeling that must have been why when I went to college, I was just attracted to architecture and also to urban design because just of the wonderful public spaces that were available in Washington for everyone. And that idea of common space for common good that's dignified and beautiful and inviting, it was just very appealing to me. And it's quite interesting, not only physical buildings, but also green space and parks, the kind of invitational common spaces that allow people of all backgrounds to come together in safety to celebrate. It's just very special. It's an integral part of, as we're going to say, our common life, the space where community can be experienced. So I haven't given up on that, even though I'm far from a practicing architect. The idea of constructing space where community can be fulfilled is just very fulfilling.
Well, it's interesting that you two.
About this?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm jumping right in because
go
I'm thinking
right in.
David's my new best friend. I want to be able to talk to him about all the things because again, so many similarities, but did you have a sense that architecture and urban design could actually be a part of helping to save the world? I mean,
absolutely.
That was a pull for me.
Absolutely. The reason I studied, when I got to college at Yale, I found out that the urban studies major that I had wanted to take had been abolished because the students were radical and allegedly had set fire to the architecture school. So the way they got rid of the radical students was to abolish the major. But a few of us put together a program, and you're absolutely right. In the early 1970s, this idea that we could construct humane and just physical environments that would allow people to live with dignity was really part of the ethos. And New Haven and New York were great experimental places where the Great Society took a physical expression in terms of building. So absolutely, I was attracted to the idea of urban design because it offered a place of dignity and safety and relief from oppressive living conditions that were so prevalent in my hometown of Washington and around the country. So absolutely, yes. We are, Elizabeth, you're going to lose control of this conversation. Bishop and I are just going to go on talking.
It's been such a joy to introduce you two to each other. So clearly many deep interests and common values and passions, but we are going to focus a little on a particular set of those. I mean, in your remarks just now, you were talking both about the inherited environment, the built environment, what we've received from the past, and at the same time seeing new structures coming up and having a sense that we're in the process of building. And I think that we feel that in this time we have inherited a world, for better and worse, and we also know we're in a moment of new building, new construction, and it raises so many deep questions for both faith and philanthropy. So I think we're gonna try to turn to that. We borrowed the idea of blueprints from your training to think about faith and philanthropy as blueprints for that common good and for the world that we're working to build and unbuild in this day and time. I'd love to start with a conversation about philanthropy itself. I mean, that's a word that we use, but it can feel a little bit abstract. And David, I'm wondering if you could just give us a definition of philanthropy for you. how is it a useful word in your idea of blueprints for a better future?
Well, the term in its origin does mean love of humanity, and central to it is a belief in the dignity and potential of every person. So philanthropy, I think, is a way to live into those values about inherent worth, and to live into the imperative of dismantling those things that stand in the way of that. I've been reading lately a reflection by our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and his latest book. I think "Love is the Answer," I believe is its name, and he quotes Martin Buber and "I Thou," and I've been thinking a lot about that philanthropy is an invitation into a healthy I Thou relationship, and that which is about mutuality, and that when properly done, when freed from kind of the hierarchy between the donor and the recipient, real philanthropy can be a mode of expressing a healthy I Thou relationship, and kind of cementing the fact that we are living together on this fragile island home, responsible for each other, and that our destinies are intertwined. So I think philanthropy done in the spirit of humility can be a vehicle for expressing what we feel and know and are called to in our faith traditions. The fact that we are divinely created, and that our job is to recognize and live into that as human beings. So that's kind of how I think about it. I must say, though, this conversation got me to think more deeply about maybe the theology of philanthropy more than perhaps I had been before.
Would you like to offer a thought on that theology?
Well, I think I do believe, particularly in this time when we are so fractured and divided, that philanthropy being, as I say, the vehicle that allows us to enter into a healthier I-thou relationship and be transformed. So that both donor and recipient, I don't even like those terms, but all involved in the dynamic of the philanthropic act, have an opportunity to be transformed and to realize how our common dignity is enhanced by supporting one another. I mean, I think that for me is what lies at the heart of this work. We're going to talk about institutional philanthropy in a minute, but in the purest sense of what is the impulse underneath the act, it feels to me that the impulse is a way of recognizing and deepening these fundamental human relationships that are mutual, dignified, and not hierarchical.
Bishop Jennifer, would you like to offer anything to that definition of philanthropy? You've worked philanthropically within faith-based institutions at great length.
Yes, and I would say amen to all of that. And there is a sense in which, because of this conversation that I've been invited into, I don't see philanthropy and faith as terms that are so far apart anymore. I really do. If you're looking at the root of it, if philanthropy is about the love of humanity, the care of the welfare of all, then that is a deeply faith-based place to begin. And so if we're going to use our metaphor of buildings, looking at blueprints, as a historic preservationist, I might want to say we need to sort of take it down to the studs and kind of begin again with what it was originally intended to be, and perhaps are now at this particular moment in history given the opportunity to go back to those original meanings, which, if we're thinking about philanthropic energy being transformative for the world, for the well-being of all, it's not just something for those who have and for those who don't have. because everyone has a stake in our mutual flourishing and well-being. So anybody and everybody is a philanthropist. And so I just beginning to recast how we use that term, how we think of one another as philanthropists. And that means it's not about how much you have in your pocket, but it's about how your heart is being extended out in care of neighbor, which is a deeply faithful and theological idea.
I love the idea too that when we recognize we are beneficiaries of the generosity of past generations, the pay it forward, the impulse just becomes really so clear. And when we also recognize that what we may be privileged to give is not of our own creation, but just that we are stewards whose job it is to thoughtfully invest what is not ours to advance the future for those we may never know and see, that becomes really the key. And to that point, I love the seventh generation notion of the Iroquois, that every act, thinking of every act, how will this benefit folks 7 generations from now? There we have the continuity between the current day and the future, which I think is another critical dimension of philanthropy.
Yes, indeed. This conversation about inheriting and carrying forward that you are both bringing to the surface in this very concrete way as the actual built environment in many respects, brings to mind a wonderful line in Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem. Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's how we step into the past and repair it. So I'm wondering how you think about that challenge in this moment, that we're inheriting a past that wants us to pay it forward, but we're also so deeply aware of the unreconciled and broken quality of that past. And so, Bishop Jennifer, I'm wondering how in your own work and institution, you're thinking about that question of reparation of what we've inherited.
Yeah, we are, I'm involved in conversations around reparations in lots of different ways in the church. And in where we are here in Central and Southern Indiana, the Episcopal Diocese, we see a lot of the basic work we do as people of faith as being reparative work. It's reconciling work, and that has to touch all elements of our common life. And so it's both a personal thing and an institutional thing for us. So one of the ways I might put some flesh on that is to think about how we've been trying to launch or to begin to step into the possibility of a capital campaign for the diocese. We have not had a capital campaign in decades here. And there are lots of reasons for that, what people believe is possible, what is the money for, and all of those things. But one of the things we became convicted of a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic shut things down and slowed things down a bit, was the notion that to go and have a capital campaign where we just assembled people of means only to decide what we need to do would be kind of classic old model philanthropy, sort of keeping the legacy that we're actually working to undo in some ways and change as we look at what we might hope the future to be. We've got to be interrupters in several places. And so we said the capital campaign can't start with folks who have lots of funds to contribute, but it needs to start with the folks who might be receiving those funds, and to ask those folks to be on the steering committee and to offer up what the determined needs are. And it's flipping that script, because we know that we are beneficiaries of a great legacy and great generosity of the past that has brought us to this place, and much of that is really good. But we also want to be creating the beloved community, which means we have to have lots of other voices at the table, typically voices that don't get to have a say at the table. And in that way, we're hoping to repair, do some reparative work to say that we can actually make decisions quite differently for the benefit of all. And we're just starting that work. So I hope to come back with you in another year to let you know how that all goes. But even to have that conversation as in our leadership bodies has been, that really good first step of just wrestling with these things in a new way.
Well, it's interesting that the philanthropic activity in your diocese is creating that space, right, for reparation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, David, I wonder, when you look at the field of organized philanthropy, which is a field you know so well, what do you see happening in that field? What do you see as the core challenges, especially as we address this question of inheriting the past and repairing it and building a better beloved community, as Bishop Jennifer helpfully suggested?
Well, there are many challenges to the philanthropic sector, the foundation sector in particular, which is what I know, that I think we have to honestly examine if we are going to be, if not totally unfettered, less fettered by our past. And I probably am best able to speak to the particular situation of philanthropy in the South, which is where I've lived for 30 years, and where there is a growing consciousness among Southern philanthropy, which for a long time was content to devote itself to the charitable relief of immediate need without examining why that need persisted. Now is beginning to look at why those needs persist, and facing the fact that wealth was built out of a racialized extractive economy that did not honor the humanity of all who lived together. So the act of doing philanthropy in a region that has a history where atonement is required, is requiring introspection. And there is a lot of welcome, courageous, not only introspection, but re-articulating what philanthropy can be in the South, to address the legacies of racial injustice. And I think we're on a journey. That's my short answer. We're on a journey that is increasingly informed by a recognition that we come out of a tortured past, and that healing is and atonement are the first steps for moving forward. In that, I mean, that is those ways of thinking are fundamental to faith traditions. And in fact, if we seek to do good, we first need to repair harm that we may have been associated with, and then move to the affirmative responsibility of shaping the future that we want. I think that's part of the conversation that philanthropy now finds itself in, and in many cases finds itself leading because we're about doing good at the core. And it was mentioned in the introduction that MDC has created a Passing Gear Philanthropy Institute. We had 4 foundations working from communities that were on the front lines of many of the racial tensions that we feel today in this country. And it was wonderful to gather staff and trustees of these foundations to begin a very deep examination of their own community history and their the way in which their philanthropic institutions had benefited from a history for which atonement was needed. And the ability to recognize that telling the truth, making amends were fundamental steps before doing good in the future. This was a sense, this was the conversation that foundations were having. And it was very, very healthy and very, very liberating, because we are living with the burdens of the past. And one of the good things about today is we're becoming increasingly conscious of the fact that we have inherited those burdens and have to atone for them. So it is a hard time for philanthropy, and it is a wonderful time for philanthropy. And I think the more we move through this process of recognition and atonement and discover who we truly are, we have a better opportunity to move into the future courageously. So it's a good time. Hard times can be good, and we're in a good hard time, and there's plenty of work to be done, and it's being done.
But it's so interesting that just as Bishop Jennifer pointed to philanthropic activity in the diocese as a place for change, David, you're really drawing on religious understanding and language to help organize philanthropy, or you're diagnosing it in many ways in a religious frame, and drawing on that rich understanding of atonement and hope. Do you feel like organized philanthropy is open to a vocabulary of attention that has religious roots and grounding? I mean, sometimes we've sort of seen a separation between organized philanthropy and faith traditions and faith-based institutions, a feeling that that's to engage too much in the world of faith is to mix up church and state or something like that. But you're really bringing a language to this situation that comes out of your own faith, as I hear it. And how is it received?
I think there are opportunities to bring this mindset and these terms of atonement and reconciliation, the asking for forgiveness and the moving forward in solidarity into the public square. I really do. And I think there is in many places an opportunity for people of faith to join with the philanthropic sector in that crusade. Not every faith tradition is comfortable or truly aligned with a frank examination of our past, but enough are that I think we are at a moment where forward movement is possible. And in this part of the country, faith language is seldom far beneath the surface. So there is an opportunity to call on what we know, to remind us of what our faith requires of us, and then to move forward. And I think there are certain kinds of kind of philanthropic structures, for instance, community foundations, which are themselves kind of endowments that are put together for the common good, can, in the best of circumstances, be the tables where these conversations about reconciliation and common purpose can happen. So I think we have some of the ingredients. In your own city of Charlottesville, Elizabeth, there happens to be a remarkable community foundation that is working assiduously to be a place where history is explored honestly and people are invited to move together into a healthy recreation of a different future. There's a living example, and the Charlottesville Community Foundation has parallels in Birmingham, in Charleston. There's a real flourishing. So I take hope from that we have the capacity and we have some of the institutional vehicles we need for this rebuilding of our history.
Thank you. Bishop Jennifer, I'm wondering how you see the role of faith-based institutions, congregations, and dioceses as we navigate this moment of inheritance and repair, and try to bring that to the common good or the beloved community. What do you see the role of the faith-based world to be?
Well, I mean, listening to David, it's just really instructive. Each person of faith is in a place, in a context, in a community. And so to be able to have the church, in my instance, doing some of the same work he's speaking of, we're looking at the legacy of slavery and white supremacy here in Indiana, and across the Episcopal Church particularly. We've chosen to step into that work a while ago, and to our credit, I think, have not abandoned it when other things could be taking our attention. We've decided that we actually have to continue to go deeper with that, looking at the complicity of the Episcopal Church in the legacy of slavery, the complicity of the funds that have built our buildings in sustaining systems that we are actually now actively trying to dismantle, while holding enough of the institution together enough to be empowered to be able to do the change work we feel God calling us to do. So it's this interesting dance, but I'm hopeful that individuals can find the language and find the courage to actually confront the histories and to help us move together with a story that's more common. I think not knowing our history has been problematic for us, both as people of faith and as a country. And to be able to kind of knit together a more common story that actually reflects the reality of what has happened from the perspectives of all the people who have lived it. I mean, that in and of itself is a transformative thing, because then knowing the fuller story, we can make a different decision about our future together, and to not be isolated with all of these disparate stories that never connect. If you've got a story that we can hold together in common that does some of that reparative work by looking at the painful past so that we can transform it, then what that means for philanthropy and what we might be able to do as a body of people who really understand that we're on the same page looking to better the whole common good, then there's no telling what we could do, but it's a hard work to do. And not everybody wants to do it because it's not pleasant. It reveals things that we would rather hide. And from a faith perspective, we know that God knows. So God, I hope, is merciful working with us as we come to the realities of understanding all of those things, and instead of shrinking away from it and wanting to tuck it away again, then we actually say, no, we can tell the story because we're transforming it, even the difficult parts, even the parts that have been damaging and genocidal and all of that. That is not, I mean, that's philanthropic work too. So it's an interesting way. I'm really taken with kind of transforming this language and owning it in a really different way, because there's some empowerment in that. And instead of saying that, we have to be stuck with the way things are and philanthropy has to operate the way it always has, well, that's really not true, is it? We can make a different decision. And as people of faith, I think we are given some great opportunities to get real about that and to be vulnerable about it, and then to do the change work that comes with that confrontation.
You've talked about story and you've talked about language, and both of those are such inheritances of our religious traditions, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
And yet finding a common vocabulary that's sufficiently deep and critical and hopeful in the public square is very hard right now. Both story and language have been so debated and divided. So how do we find a language to shine a light on what's happening and to talk with one another about it that brings us together? What do we know about language and all of this? And both of you are masters of language. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I think the first thing is about how we listen.
Yeah.
I think if we're going to lean into understanding someone else's story, which is something that we're hoping could become part of our story, I put a lot of weight in the listening part of it and wanting to be curious and actually wanting to know. I just think about what are the conversations that we want to be able to lean into? What are the things that draw us closer? And there's something about actually being curious enough and saying that my story is not complete.
Yes.
Even my historical story is not complete until I know what your story is, and taking the time to actually listen and understand that, and not to challenge that story, but just to understand it and to hear it and receive it as a gift. And it sounds really, people might say there's not a lot you can do with that. It's a little fluffy and soft. And yet whole civilizations have actually progressed over time in the ability to have listening circles and places where people can know that they are known, loved, and heard. Those three things,
Yes.
I think, can go a long way to healing the things we're talking about, which are about relationship and trying to knit together a narrative that doesn't mean that it's only one story, but it can't be common until we've heard it. The common is not the neutralization of the story. It's not the taking away the parts of the story we don't like. It's about just hearing it and holding it. So I would hope for more opportunities to do that, and for people of faith, whatever their faiths are, who are largely peoples of narrative and story, to find the grace to be able to make that invitation to people we don't even know, and to see what happens with that. I think it could be transformative, because it has been in the past.
One of the things that we have done in our work, in MDC's work with foundations and staff and trustees, is particularly when those foundations are working in place, when they are concerned about a particular geography, is to lead the foundation leaders through a building of a history timeline that actually shows how local people, those of influence and without, have responded, anticipated, or avoided decisions as time has passed, and then to interview those patterns of behavior to see where has courage emerged, where has fear shown itself, and what does this say about our habitual response as a community when we are faced with a challenge, an opportunity, a grave injustice, an opportunity for healing? Have we seized that? Have we run from it? And what has resulted? We've done this history timeline activity, and Elizabeth, your own work has helped inform this greatly. We've done this probably for 20 or 30 years with groups of civic leaders who care about a common geography. What's remarkable is, as the bishop was saying, how much of our shared history has been so edited or airbrushed that we don't really understand the whole picture. But when we are able to build our history collectively and then add our individual family recollections to the common history, a narrative portrait of our evolution emerges. And then that can be examined for the moments in which we stepped up, the moments in which fundamental humanity expressed itself, and the moments in which we caved in the face of opportunity. And that kind of telling of story, diagnosing story, and drawing lessons from story, I think can tell us what the blueprint for the future might entail. It's a very simple and powerful act to reconstruct the evolution of the place we all call home, and to ask ourselves, how did we become who we are, the good and the bad? To see the fact that human choice has had consequences, and therefore the choices we make today will have consequences for the future. I think it's an important act, and it's not coincidental when we think of our liturgy and our how much the telling of the story over and over again both inspires us and reminds us of what we are capable of and what we are incapable of just by acting on our own impulses. So this idea of story, I think, is a key to healing, and maybe one of the blueprints for the beloved community.
I love that. You have me thinking, David, that you can only rehearse the story you know.
Yes.
Right. And so how much we can be enriched by just holding more stories and knowing them. And you can't step into empathy fully, I think, until we've had that experience of being able to hold someone else's story. And I think empathy is a key part of the philanthropic enterprise. And so it's all tied together.
It is, and it's all tied together and rooted in place. Going back to the birth of your own visions and vocations in specific places. This organizational history timeline exercise that David's talking about brings people together on the basis of a place they share in common. And I think that sometimes the storytelling, story listening practice that we do doesn't sufficiently root in that common place. But when we are introduced to each other through that organizational timeline in a specific place, we discover surprising things about each other. I mean, I'll just say briefly, I used this with a church retreat in Decatur, Georgia. And it was a group where there were a few young people and many more people my age and older, as we see in many congregations. And when folks signed in on the church's history timeline and then introduced themselves from the moment they signed in and what brought them there, what was going on in their own lives, that they became part of it, lo and behold, one of the youngest people in the room signed in earliest, and one of the oldest people in the room signed in last. And if I had not had that wonderful tool that David has taught and Kathy Tyler Scott long ago helped develop,
yes,
I would never have. And that learning to see one another and be surprised by one another is also perhaps part of the blueprint for the common good.
Absolutely, absolutely, and these are healthy practices that that I think can do a lot to initiate healing from in safety, because telling hard stories is very hard. There is very often a lot of anguish, and the deeper we go into the causes of our discontent, the social fractures that are so profound and so crippling, the harder the stories can become. But when we join our story into the shared story, we build the tapestry. There's a wonderful years ago, one of the ministers at church quoted a wonderful, I think this is true. I choose to believe this is true. She quoted an English mystic, Sister Mary Clare, who said, "We live in a time when," and this is true today, "we live in a time when things are unraveling, and things that are unraveling cannot be patched. Our job in a time when things are coming apart is not to patch what is unraveling, but to build the loom on which the next pattern can be woven." And I really love that. And I think history exposed candidly can reveal the threads that we use to build the next pattern. I really do. And this idea of confronting ourselves in order to redeem ourselves and deploy ourselves, I think is psychologically and theologically a necessity. So I hope we're going through a period, I think we are in America, where we're being challenged to, as a nation, figure out what a more accurate narrative is, so we can stand together and build for the future. And it is not easy, but it's necessary work. And faith and philanthropy, faith and philanthropic institutions can be platforms for that essential narrative work to happen.
But part of that requires a vision of where we're headed. And we threw into the title of this conversation, common good, question mark. Is the common good, is that an adequate concept for what we're building toward, Bishop Jennifer?
I think it can be, I think it's enough of a term to hold it. But I'm just struck that it's difficult reckoning kind of work, because to be working for the common good, to get there to this beloved community, which is about, building a community where all can thrive, all are loved, right? Period. No conditions, we're not putting qualifiers on it. We're trying to make space for the other. I mean, I care about your well-being and your flourishing as much as I care about my own. That's a pretty tall order, which is why we're not there, right? If it was easy, we would have gotten there. But part of it, aligned with the conversation we've been having, is that to hear a different story or to have a different common narrative, it means each of us, no matter where we are in that narrative, having to reassess who we are or who we thought we were. And there's some grieving to be done with that. And I wonder if, with all of the unrest and just all of the difficulties we're seeing in this common moment, that we actually need to tend to what that means for us as a society, not just individual grief, but this loss of who we thought we were. And for many, like we all hold different perspectives of what that means. And so there's this sense of, if we want this thing out there, this common good, we have to actually be willing to hold some other things a lot more lightly than we have. I can only be me if I have this story and this history as it's been told to me only. We have to be able to have an open hand. And to me, if we've got open hands, then that allows the common story, the common good, the common welfare, the openness to receiving someone else's story to actually be possible. But if we're so wedded to my story is the only story that matters, or my family's origin story is the only story that has prominence, we won't get to the common good. And I think I may have mentioned previously in the conversation we had earlier, was that I have found it interesting that I've been challenged on what common good means. And so one of the things we actually have to do is maybe perhaps have an understanding of what we understand that to be. What is the common good? Can we agree on a definition of that? Because that'll help us have a chance at getting there.
I struggle with common good, and I have increasingly gravitated toward the notion of beloved community, because of what the beloved community seems to stand for. It's a picture of abundance, of peace, of harmony, and a place free of hierarchy. For one of the stumbling blocks to the common good, I think, is a zero-sum or scarcity mentality. The fact that the only way we can arrive at the common good is for one of us to sacrifice some element of our well-being. Now, if the common good really prevailed, good might be held in common. But getting to that from where we are, a world that has fallen into the sin of private property rather than public wealth, of scarcity rather than abundance, makes this issue of the common good, I think, fraught with fear for a lot of us, fraught with loss, material loss, and it's hard. I think for people of faith, there's a magnetic pull of the notion of beloved community that gets us to look at what we need to do, the journey we need to take in a different way, that may be less focused on the issues of material goods and power, which is another thing we haven't talked about, and more on the end destination that can only be arrived at through repentance, atonement, transformation, and hope. That's a different currency than the political material currency that I think is often attached to the notion of a common good. This issue of this paradox of scarcity in the wealthiest society in the world is really a stumbling block. It's a stumbling block to so much, to the real mutuality that we talk about as being core to philanthropy, and to getting to a place where everybody is provided what they need to be able to thrive and contribute. That's really hard. So I think we've got some mindset issues, the zero sum, the scarcity, the fear that makes moving toward the common good so much more difficult. Maybe beloved community is the language that we ought to explore as a faith community and try to live into. I think this is hard. Again, it's one of these hard things. We're in a time where we're getting down to third rail issues. This is where you can get a bad shock if you're not careful. But we've got to get there. Got to get to those things. So Elizabeth, I don't know. We're not giving you didn't ask for answers in this conversation, did you? You're not
Never.
getting too many.
Never. No, but I think we asked for help, blueprints, deeply understood, and asked whether faith and philanthropy might help provide those. And you have so wonderfully already offered up so many elements of each. So I think as we enter into a conversation about what beloved community is, faith and philanthropy really need to help frame the conversation, help us visit our stories and find the language and a vision.
Well, I do think faith frees us from fear, and we can't enter these conversations unless we are not afraid, unless we know we're held in safety, and can move forward because we are sacred and beloved, and bad things will not befall us. I mean, to my mind, that's the faith, that's the strength that faith provides us to be able to enter into the difficult spaces. We need not be afraid, even though things might look scary, and things look very scary. But faith tells us, be not afraid. And I would just say, you're talking to two African-American people whose stories are stories where faith, our family story, faith overcame fear. So I take great comfort from that. And I have to remember, if my ancestors did it, no excuse for me.
Well, right. I often lean back and I go, oh my goodness, my grandmother traveling, having to, run from the Klan, going through upstate New York. This is not hard right here. Like, I have not seen trouble, right? Like, how do we lean on that legacy and that strength in this time? Because faith communities this is part of what wakes me up every day. Like, faith communities have to be the place where we can be real. And they haven't always been that, you know, people find themselves in congregations for all kinds of reasons. But increasingly, what people are saying to me is, I want to be in a church community where I can be vulnerable, where I can be real, where I can talk about the shameful past and overcome it, and know that someone will still love me tomorrow. Like, we're not going to leave you on the side because you've wrestled with these things. And if we have more of those kinds of communities, then that's part of the transformation I think we're hoping for. But we've got to create those spaces. And I think philanthropy can do that. The Central Indiana Community Foundation has gone all in on creating circles of conversation on dismantling white supremacy and racism. And it is a beautiful thing to behold that they're even stepping into that work. I want to give a lot of credit to Brian Payne and the other leaders there who are creating opportunities for these kind of conversations that we're having in the church, but in the philanthropic space and for the benefit of the whole community. I mean, that is a huge development that makes me proud about what philanthropy can do, like in the best sense. So
thank you so much. Well, we have a community of listeners here who have been actively asking questions, I can tell, and exclaiming and amening and thanking you both for your comments. And David King, you've rejoined us, and I think you're going to help share some of the questions in the little time we have left. We've got about another 10 minutes of this. It's just the beginning of a conversation.
Well, I'll do my best. There are a number of great questions, and I'd encourage you to keep dropping them in and introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. That's been a welcome addition to see all the places people are coming from and the work that they do. A couple of questions that kind of came up from the very beginning, you know, building out from your backgrounds in preservation and thinking about local congregations is we're in, you know, the future of faith communities is an interesting inflection point, thinking about our inability to gather together in place in many of our congregations in the midst of the COVID pandemic, as well as changes in how we gather and the future of faith communities and their role in this work. There were a couple other questions that talked about, you know, the sort of congregations in some ways that may need to close or to change, or, you know, I might give a shout out to our colleagues and partners for Sacred Spaces. Bishop Jennifer, I know you work closely with them, that as a place that can help in some of those conversations of preservation of stained glass windows, other types of other work in that space in particular. But maybe you could just give a comment, a reflection on what do you see the future, the hope, or the around local faith communities in this larger work for the common good and more generally. Bishop Jennifer, why don't I let you jump in?
Okay, I know time is limited, so I'll just say this. I truly believe that our church buildings are assets, even when they are more than we can handle. And they become assets when we have relationships that are not just intra-congregational, but are actually extensions to the community. And so I think we're in a wonderful opportunity right now to think about how do our buildings contribute to the beloved community or the common good in our neighborhoods, wherever they are. And, you know, it's a separate question from having the finances to keep them open for ourselves, but it's about broadening what we think those buildings are for, and the ways in which in many communities, faith buildings have been the hub of gathering, of convening, of work of healing and justice and temporal needs. And I think that's a conversation we need to ramp up, because it may be that even if there's no longer a congregation in some of those buildings, that those needs and ways of serving the community can still be met, but perhaps hosted by a different sector of people. So lots more to explore there.
Thanks, Jennifer. David, any thoughts there you want to add?
Well, you know, I'm seeing such wonderful expressions of faith, ecumenism, all in behavior as congregational buildings become platforms for delivering relief and hope for under these COVID conditions. There are wonderful examples in the city where I live, Durham, North Carolina, of people coming together in congregational spaces they never would have known to collect and distribute food and resources to people they don't know. But another kind of community is being fostered as people are called to collective generosity. And there's holy work going on in these spaces, even if it may not be in the sanctuary. So something is happening. And the fact that where are some of the spaces that people turn to do common work in hard times? It is holy spaces. And so if we cannot forget that, but recall that and build on that as we go into the future, I think there can be a future.
That's really helpful. And coming from the other side, several folks, we have a wide variety of people on the webinar that maybe work in professional philanthropy, community foundations as fundraisers, and questions really resonating with the language that you've both been mentioning today, and noting that divide that Elizabeth brought us to, where some foundations are, professionalized philanthropy, are scared or skittish in some ways to engage with religion. When is it, if we work as frontline fundraisers or in professionalized philanthropy, how and when can we use that language or build from those faith perspectives and contexts into our work? And David, maybe I'll start with you, having done that work. It's how do you do that work in the philanthropy side of the street?
Well, I think there is a huge opportunity to recognize what the non-sectarian work of faith-centered organizations as builders of full and wholesome, dignified communities. And as long as we can recognize the human work that I'll say is not explicitly evangelical, but is very much holy work, there's a vast opportunity for people who desire to improve conditions to connect with faith-centered institutions. I've got a really great friend, maybe she's on this webinar, who runs Interfaith Action in St. Paul, Minnesota. She's a Jewish woman running what was a council of churches that now is interfaith. And she has people, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, engaged in putting their talent to work to shift patterns of economic mobility for people stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder. People are coming together because their faith traditions call them to change outcomes for vulnerable people. And she has created a space where people can bring whatever the origins of that impulse to bear on really important social change, systems change work. There's a powerful example. She was a foundation director. Now she's a Jewish leader running a former council of churches with multi-faith actors doing social change. That's what we're capable of.
That's great. Bishop Jennifer, thoughts from being a development frontline staff member?
No, the one thing I would say is that the words we choose matter. And so back to Elizabeth's question about what we call things, what I find is that we're often talking about this very same thing, so we're using different words to get there. So, I haven't been active in development in a while, but I do wonder about whether the philanthropic community can be seeking to listen in a different way, perhaps the folks who they would never have listened to because the religious label is up, but to say, we're all working in the same purpose. And again, those motivations, as David said, might be coming from a religious source, but there's some listening to do to help actually find a partner that will help you get there. And so in Indianapolis, we talk a lot about networking and working with anybody who is going for the cause of transformation that we're hoping for. And it's people of faith, people of no faith, no claimed faith, folks who or in any sector, because we know that regardless of the language, the particular words, we actually are trying to get to the same place. And so I just wonder about perhaps letting some of those guards down around the language and listening, and to see whether there's a partner in the work.
Bishop Jennifer, that takes me back to your image of being open-handed and how people of faith need to be open-handed towards people who don't identify that way, and people in philanthropy open-handed toward people of faith. I think that you have really given me some new vocabulary to furnish my imagination, and David, you as well. Just really, really appreciate all of the things that you have helped us think about, see, and say today.
One last question we might end, and I'll just throw it out there. If you had one or two quick takeaways, is there is the notion, I think we've had a lot of resonance with the language and the broad way we've had the conversation, but a couple of folks, rightfully so, are thinking, okay, now what do we do next? Is there, oftentimes philanthropy moves to action before we do some of that introspection work, but is there a practice that you might, or a next step that you might encourage us to take as we live into this kind of conversation? David, you want to start, and I'll let Jennifer have the
Well, I think the step, so I'm going to make an assumption that in institutional philanthropy, our institutions are institutions of privilege, and we have the challenge, as Brian Stevenson, Equal Justice Institute reminds us, of moving to a position of proximity with people who are directly hurting. And so I think the next step is to find ways to collapse the space and collapse the distance between those of us who might be in privileged positions with the ability to direct or shape the movement of resources, to come into more direct, honest, authentic, respectful proximity to people who have been on the receiving end of systems that don't work. That's a whole nother webinar, Elizabeth. But I think we're challenged to proximity. Those of us who have positions of influence are challenged to enter into proximity. And I think that's the next step for all of us. That's real work.
Thanks, David. Jennifer?
This is so easy. You just gave me the threw me the ball. So yes to all of that. And I would commend this practice that's been transformative to me over the last many months of this pandemic. I have been choosing for my daily walk to get outside, to go to neighborhoods that I would never find myself in, or that I would typically just drive through. And I've been going to them repeatedly, walking for an hour up and down neighborhood streets, talking with whoever happens to be there. At one point, I went down to a park in Indianapolis and ended up coming back and joining these young kids in a workout, because I thought I would never have opportunity to have conversations with these young people doing burpees on the lawn, but I'm going to do that because I need to know something about their world for the work I do, and I would never do it and get to know their world if I'm not putting myself in their spaces. So to be really intentional, where else can you walk to encounter just the rest of the world, even if it's in your own neighborhood? And then who else needs to be a conversation partner with you in this? Like, to make a list. And it may be a lot of people you don't know, but if for people of some access and privilege, we know how to get ourselves in those places and just be open to where those conversations may take us.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, that invitation that you've given us to see differently, all of you in this conversation, to sort of see the world in which we work differently, and with more openness and open-handedness, as Elizabeth reminded us. It's been a great gift to have you all open up this conversation for us and for so many. And it's an invitation to continue these conversations, which we would love to do. I'm so grateful for all of you who've joined us through our Distinguished Visitors Dialogue through Lake Institute. We'd be grateful to send you the recording as it's available, so that you could listen to it again, reflect upon it, and pass it on to others. We'll send out a short survey too, just so you can tell us how this was helpful, and maybe suggest other types of conversations in which which we can help engage you with as well. So I want to say thanks so much to David, to Bishop Jennifer, and to Elizabeth for hosting, for Rafi on our Lake team, who really helped coordinate this whole process. So we're so grateful for your time, and we look forward to being with you again sometime in the future.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.